Welcome to Principal Center Radio, helping you build capacity for instructional leadership. Here's your host, Director of the Principal Center, Dr. Justin Bader.
Welcome everyone to Principal Center Radio. I'm your host, Justin Bader, and I'm honored to welcome back to the program Dr. Douglas Fisher. Douglas Fisher, PhD, is Professor and Chair of Educational Leadership at San Diego State University and a teacher leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. He's published numerous articles on reading and literacy, differentiated instruction, and curriculum design, as well as books such as the Teacher Clarity Playbook, now in its second edition, Your Introduction to PLC Plus, The Illustrated Guide to Teacher Credibility, the Teaching Reading Playbook, and Welcome to Teaching. And in 2022, he was inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame by the Literacy Research Association. And we're here today to talk about his new book, RIGOR Unveiled, a video-enhanced flipbook to promote teacher expertise in relationship building, instruction, goals, organization, and relevance.
And now, our feature presentation.
Doug, welcome back to Principal Center Radio.
Thank you. It's good to be talking to you again.
Yeah, it's been a while, but we've done this many times before, talking about a handful of your many books, many with Nancy Fry. And I'm very excited to talk about this one. I wonder if we could start by talking about the format, which people will notice is a little bit different than the average paperback that might be on your shelf. Why is this a flip book? What does that mean?
Well, we wanted to turn it on a different orientation so people could flip it over literally and set it up and look at what we wrote. So when we had this idea, how do we take aspects of high quality learning, make them really accessible with fewer words and more video? For example, we don't do a lot of definitions of academic language. Instead, if there's a word that's bold, and if that's unfamiliar or unclear, there's a video glossary that you can watch a coach talk about this concept. So then we save some words there. We created this spotted happenings, so variation of what this might look like. So we really wanted it to sit on its side so teams could have a conversation about each of the 25 aspects that are profiled. There are videos, there are coaching conversations on each of those videos. So the bulk of the work was actually collecting those 25 videos and then the 25 coaches' comments on those videos, and then 3 much longer, more than 10-minute long videos with a coaching conversation between 3 people. So we spent a lot of time on that. That's why we called it video enhanced. We tried to keep all of the topics to one page, and then the backside would be like a scale of, progression of skill, maturity matrix, some people call it, like if you're starting out here and moving next to next to next.
Yeah, well, I'm very interested in that concept and in this kind of show rather than tell approach. Is that fair? That it's very much about showing people, as you said, what it looks like. And this is a topic that I've been interested in for a long time. Some of our listeners will know that my second book with Heather Bell Williams, Mapping Professional Practice, attempts to tackle some of those same challenges of how do we figure out what it is that we're talking about? How do we know what we're looking for? And how do we get into some of the professional judgment and opportunities for improvement that are in this very complex work of teaching? And you said you focus on 25 practices?
Yes.
How did you decide on those practices?
Super interesting. So rigor, we chose that word intentionally. Rigor is not a popular word in the teaching space. In fact, it may be the most unpopular word.
It's mean, right?
And when you ask people why, it's because it's vague. What does it mean? And sometimes leaders use the word against teachers. You're not rigorous enough. Your class is not rigorous enough. And then the conversation goes like this. Well, what do you mean? What do you want me to change? You're not rigorous enough. So there's this vagueness to it. So we set out a couple of years ago to what do we mean by rigor? Like internally, what do we say? When we say rigor, what do we mean by it? So we went through some definitional process. We went through some thinking through it. Then we looked at what other people have written, scholarly articles and things, and said there are 90 something indicators that people have put together. But which ones are high leverage? Which ones are most important? And so we narrowed it down with some opinions of ours. And then we started a quasi-Delphi process, and we would send it out. Over 400 leaders responded, and they essentially voted on the indicators. And they said, this is more important than this. This is less important than this. Or, hey, you missed this one, or this word doesn't fit with me. So it's quasi-Delphi process. And through that crowdsourcing, I guess, we narrowed it down to the top 25. And then we started cataloging them and came up with, and then we ended up using the word rigor, and a little, forcing it. So we argue that rigor starts with relationships, that student-teacher relationships make it safe for kids to take academic risks. You have to have high quality instruction. That doesn't surprise people. You have to have learning goals that line up with expectations from the state or province that you're working in. And then organization, how do you organize the learning environment? And then last is relevance. Now, we went through a process, and some reviewers did not agree that relevance was part of rigor. And I thought that was super interesting. In fact, one of them wrote, you can't make an algebra class relevant to students. They just have to learn it. And I was shocked by that. I mean, I just was really like, if it's important and the teacher brings passion to it, young people are going to say, this is worth it. I'm going to pay attention to this. So those are the 5 categories. And then we chose the top 5 indicators in each of those categories.
And that's how you get to 25.
That's how we got to 25.
So yeah, readers will notice that rigor is an acronym there. And I like that you're starting with relationship building, because one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially as more companies emphasize AI, and a lot of people in the tech industry say, oh, well, AI is going to replace teachers and AI is going to be more effective than teachers. And one of my main reactions to that idea is that I don't think kids will work for an AI. I think they will work for a human teacher who cares about them and who, as you said, can demonstrate that relevance and help kids see the connection. So take us into relationships a little bit. What were some of the dimensions that you identified of relationships?
I love that you're saying that. And I think some of those people think that teaching and learning is transmission of knowledge. And AI is pretty good at that. But that's not how I think learning is way more than that, like you were saying. It's about this relationship that we have. It's this supportive, responsive, human connection. When you have that human connection, it makes it safe to take a risk. And that's really important. And so in the relationship column, it gets increasingly more complex as you go down the column. The first thing, and one of the most popular things that we saw in the Delphi was, does the teacher know the student's name, and does the teacher use the student's name in productive ways? That is so basic. And yet Resqualia's study showed that 52% of kids think their teacher doesn't know their name. And 52 when Resqualia, I think he had 67,000 kids in his My Voice survey. 52% said my teacher doesn't know my name. Now, my guess is it's not kindergarten teachers, because you have 20 of them. You have 210 high schoolers, so it's probably that. Although I didn't read it for the grade levels. So basically, to have a strong relationship, you should know people's names, and you should know some things about them. The second level is around proximity. Do you get an arm's length of students? And there's good research about being connected, immediacy research about being connected. And so then it deepens. My favorite indicator in the relationships column is the 4th one, and it's around academic risk-taking. Sorry, it's about academic risk-taking, which is a really interesting concept. And research going back to at least 1988, Margaret Clifford talking about which of the students raise their hand to offer things. Which of the students raise their hand to get the teacher's attention and ask questions, like probing questions and clarifying questions, and say, hey, I have an idea. Which students choose to do the more complex things? And that labeled was academic risk-taking. For me, saying to adolescents, I want you to be a risk taker, is a little risky, so I don't like that. So at our school, we call it the courage to learn. How do we build that courage to learn? Well, it occurs in a place that is safe. It occurs at a place with relational trust and psychological safety. So that's why it's in relationships. People ask me all the time, why do you care so much about student and teacher relationships? I care because it makes the environment safe for young people to learn and take academic risks.
Very well said. And it strikes me, having seen my kids go through, learning a couple different sports and joining teams and things like that, people are not good at new things, right? Nobody is immediately good at something that's new and challenging. And especially if the subject is one they weren't already interested in, that willingness to try something that you're not good at is a big hurdle for kids. And yeah, so important to guide them over that.
It's not specifically called out in this book, but there's a concept that Nancy and I have been playing a lot more with lately. and that's success failure ratios. And so what we were just saying made me think about this is, if your success failure ratio in fill in the blank, art, math, is really highly tipped to failure, you come to expect failure. And then your teacher says, you learn from failure. But I want to interrupt that. And this comment that we learn from failure, I really want to interrupt it. I don't believe that's true. I think we learn from what happens after we fail, not from the failure itself. If I gave you all a calculus exam right now and you all failed it, and if I gave it to you again tomorrow, is that going to suddenly make you get it because failure, you learn from failure? No, it would have to be something that happened after that highlighted for you new learning, scaffolding, go to ChatGPT and do a lesson, go to YouTube and watch a video, something. And so I want to interrupt this idea that we say to kids, failure's how we learn. Because kids who have high levels of failure, their failure success ratio is really tipped to failure, quit. Why would you keep doing something if you experience failure over and over and over? And kids who have high success ratios, like I'm successful, come to expect success, and they say mistakes and errors as temporary, transient, and unimportant because generally they're successful.
And how much of that is about planning? How much of that is about scaffolding? How do we interrupt that, as you said, for the kids who maybe are experiencing too high a ratio of failure?
I think scaffolding and chunking are part of our solution, and that's why I'm working so much on this right now. How do we increase the percent of time students experience success in the learning environment without taking it down to like, okay, you're a seventh grader, so I'm going to teach you the fifth grade standards, which is what we did in the past. Do I chunk this lesson so that you have 5 minutes, 8 minutes of learning, and you say, I got this now. Now I'm going to give you 5 or 8 or whatever more minutes. Now you got it. If we scaffold and chunk and then release responsibility and then fade the scaffolds, I think we need so much more working and thinking about how do we parse lessons so that we increase the frequency that students experience success.
Absolutely, and that kind of speaks to the O in rigor, organization. And tell us a little bit more about organization, because sometimes there are limited opportunities for teachers to exercise their own judgment, their own discretion over how things are organized. If they're following a pacing guide, if they're following a textbook, how do you approach that question of organization?
Yeah, and sometimes we all work in systems where there are rules handed from others, and so we have to negotiate within the existing realities of our systems. But the things we can control are the learning resources in the environment, the grouping patterns that we use. And we got decades of research on ability grouping and permanent ability grouping. That's not a great idea, and yet we see it still happening. And in fact, like the kindergarten study in mathematics showed that permanent ability groups was the worst thing you could do to get achievement to change in mathematics in kindergarten. So we keep seeing these things. Um, so the organization internally, how you respond to problematic behavior is super important. You know, shame and humiliation, not a great idea. Tolerating it, not a great idea. And so how do you create an environment, organization? One of the things that's on that in the O indicator is around the environment, the resources in the environment, specifically like walls and classroom organization. It's fascinating. So in that case, we draw on the third teacher research from Italy, where they argue that the first teacher is the grown-up, the adult or the paid person. The second teacher are the peers, and if we are willing to mobilize the peers for learning. And the third teacher is the environment that we create. And we extend that to say, what do you put on the walls? Some of the walls, like the team poster, together everyone achieves more. Is that actually helping us learn something? Or is it so cluttered with things around the room that I can't even access a language chart or a sound wall or the periodic table of the elements when I need to help? What is the environment and what's the environment doing to help me learn something? I kind of have a position that old student work from weeks ago probably shouldn't be on the walls. I know people love that. I don't want to offend people, but put it in the hallways. Um, what do the students need in this environment that will assist their learning right now? That's what the environment's supposed to do. So that's been an interesting one to play out around how do you organize physically the environment to impact the learning? It's a tiny bit, but there's a lot of it that goes in. That's why there's 25 of them and not one. But if you have no learning resources, some secondary teachers change class every period or twice a day or 3 times a day. It's harder for them to mobilize the environment for their students learning in that class. I get that. That's a reality that you have to confront. Now, you said also, let me make a connection. You said something about peers, or I said something about peers in response. So the second teacher about peers, there are 2 different places in the rigor matrix that relate to peers. The first one is in relationships, because part of our sense of self and our belonging comes from how other people, other peers treat us. So the relationship column includes that, but so does the instruction. Do the learning experiences that the teacher designs allow students to talk to each other using academic language, to consolidate their understanding and thinking through interactions with their peers? So we have peers in there twice, because the second teacher is mobilizing the peers, and there are way more learners than there are teachers. And so if we can learn to mobilize the peers as support and feedback, we might actually get better outcomes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have any advice for teachers who feel like there's plenty of peer mobilization, but it's just talking about anything, not actually talking about the lesson? Because, many of us as kids remember, getting in trouble for talking. I won't say that I specifically did, but I hear that a lot from people my age. Oh, yeah, I used to get in trouble for talking all the time in school. And I think so often our response as educators is, the less talking, the better. But that's not really what we want. We don't want less talking. We just want the talking to be on task. We want it to be moving forward in terms of our learning goals, not just socializing and chit chat.
And we want it to be academic. We want to approximate academic language, sometimes called the language of the lesson. And I think one of the things that's missing in that is individual accountability. My well intended, well meaning teachers put us in groups because they knew that if they could get us talking and consolidating, we would learn. Because part of learning includes interacting or negotiating meaning with others. The problem is we could talk about whatever we wanted. Because if the teacher was on the other side of the room, which we did, we could talk about whatever we wanted. And the world has now learned a lot more about individual accountability. So I think about things, we call them basic group work and productive group work. Basic group work has no accountability. Like turn to your partner and talk, partner A, partner B, etc. If you choose that, the teacher has to be vigilant in the classroom. You have to be monitoring. You have to be listening in, taking notes, and figuring out what to say next. If you want to meet with a small group, if you want to organize the materials, if you want to move yourself to the other side of the room and work with a group of students, you have to build individual accountability into the group task, because that would be your monitoring rather than you personally monitoring all the groups. It could be as simple as, here's a piece of chart paper, here are 4 colors of markers, contribute to this chart paper in the marker that I've assigned you, put your name in the bottom in this color. When I come back, I'm going to ask you why you wrote this in red and why you wrote this in blue. Individual accountability. I mean, there's so many that we've created as a profession, these protocols that hold students accountable for the work they do in their peers.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the accountability discussion gets reduced to how are the points or how are the grades given out. But it sounds like you're talking about that interpersonal accountability. Like, I'm going to ask you, you wrote in red, talk to me about that in that relationship.
Yeah, I want to know more about it. Tell me your thinking. So I say this, I said this before. To go back to, you wrote this in red. What if your peer told you the answer was 24? That's not what I'm talking about. But if your peer said the answer is 24 because, and then you said, how did you know that? Tell me again. Explain it to me. Oh, I agree. I disagree. And now when you know the answer is 24 and I come by and say, tell me about 24, I don't actually care in the collaborative phase if you quote from your peer, if you understand it. If you just tell me the answer is 24 and I don't have any evidence of negotiating understanding, then I'm not so pleased with that. I want to hear the thinking, the processing, the explanation, the argumentation. Like, I agree with you and I disagree with you, and we're allowed to do that. Doesn't mean we turn it into a fight. It turns into a, how did you know that? Why do you think that? Show me where you found that. That's the negotiation I want. While we say that, I want to jump back to instruction. We call it input, kind of honoring Madeline Hunter. It might also be called micro learning today. The new learning. Generally, I believe we are seeing a reduction in the range of things that teachers use for input, new learning. Direct instruction works for some things. Modeling works, think alouds work, worked examples work, demonstrations, simulations. We have a whole range of introducing learners to new concepts and skills. I think we have to rethink the quality of the whole class new learning or input. Is it approximating grade level? Is it inviting learners in? Is it going too long that they check out with cognitive overload? I think we've pushed so much into small group instruction, and I think there are some needs of small group instruction. I worry that we push so much into small group instruction that people think that the new learning and the whole class isn't that important anymore.
For all the evidence that we have about the effectiveness of direct instruction, I would say for most of my career, there has been a pretty strong sentiment that direct instruction is regrettable, right? Like if you have to teach anything directly, you kind of should be doing something more innovative instead. And probably that comes from our own experience as students of being lectured at for too long, on things that perhaps were not interesting to us. So there are better and worse ways to approach that. But you're saying we should not write off or disregard the importance of sharing content in that way. Want to say more about that?
Yeah, there's this shape that has these squiggly lines. And I could spend the next 6 weeks with you as a kindergartner or a first grader, having you discover the sound that letter makes. Or I could tell you and practice you. And you could acquire that way faster. There are some things that just are faster, more efficient, and deeper learning when you move into direct instruction. I think the backlash on direct instruction is boring and way too long and drill, and actually violating what the research says about direct instruction, that it includes practice and application and a check for understanding, and it doesn't go on for 35 minutes.
Well, Doug, I know we can't get into all 25 of the specifics that you get into in the book, but one kind of general issue that I wanted to ask about, because you have I think, a pretty up close perspective on this, is the challenge of seeing something that is not necessarily directly observable. And in our book, we call this the idea of observability bias. Like sometimes we focus on the surface features of a practice simply because those are the things that are easiest to observe. But a lot of good teaching is hard to directly observe. There are nuances to it that you have to do. And there are things that happen in your head as a teacher that are hard for someone else to observe and really know fully just from looking what it is that you're doing. And this is a book that is all about making things visible to people. Like, how do we tackle that challenge of the real heart of practice not being directly observable? Like, there being aspects that you can't necessarily see and copy.
And so part of the indicators, when you dig deep into them, part of them are asking some reflective questions of teachers. I care about how teachers think about what they're doing. I care when teachers say, this is why I chose to do this. And then there's this conversation about the what we saw, but the thinking behind it. The part that's more invisible. We don't see teachers like in a live lesson often like collecting evidence and then using that evidence the next day and the next day and the next day. That's something we have to talk about. What evidence informed this lesson? And there's a difference between a teacher says, I have 180 days and I have 180 lessons and I'm going to teach them no matter what, which is the teacher I used to have, and like literally file folders of every single day of the school year, versus here's how I'm adjusting this to get the learning outcomes to happen based on the evidence I have. We don't get a lot of that in an observation. So there is that bias there because you have to actually dig deeper. You have to have more conversation. You have to think through this. Now, it's easy to say the teacher is using students' names in harsh ways. The teacher is not greeting students by name. It's easy to see that. It's more nuanced to watch the nonverbal communication about how students experience the classroom. It's more nuanced to say, wow, over the last 3 visits to this classroom, that kid never got recognized when the kid wanted to be recognized. And so it is digging deeper than that, to really think about what is happening in that environment that is contributing to the learning of students.
Yeah. And I think that that conversation really is at the heart of it, because hearing from people in their own words, what their thinking is. And sometimes they haven't even verbalized it for themselves. So being forced to say it out loud often is very valuable for people who might be, going intuitively, and acting based on their experience. But yeah, that whole process of reflecting, of talking about practice, I think is really at the heart of any kind of professional growth and professional learning from one another.
I'll give you an example of that internal thinking. So I was asked to go to this middle school several hours from here, and some teachers asked me for feedback. So I said, sure, I'll come to your class and I'll give you feedback, coaching, whatever. And so I watched a classroom, and the teacher called on 14 students while I was there. All 14 were volunteers. They all chose to be called on. So I said to the teacher at one of there were many conversations, but one of them was, here's what I noticed. I noticed that 14 students had the opportunity to respond in class. You called on 14 students. All of them were volunteers. Tell me about this. The teacher said, our middle school has experienced a significant increase in bullying. And so right now we're only taking volunteers as a school because when kids are being called on at random, the peers are teasing them, and we need to get this under control. That is a very logical thought process. I have no right to come in and say, you should use teacher choice, you should use random choice, because I need to hear the thinking. Now, how the teacher said, why would I ever call on students randomly because they're just going to say the wrong thing in my class? That's a different logic to that. What she said was, our school had a conversation. We suspended this 2 weeks ago. We're letting kids volunteer right now, trying to calm down this extensive bullying that's been happening on social media, outside the school day, etc. I had a great conversation with this teacher. I talked about student-to-student interaction and how respectful they were. I saw multiple times where students talked to each other using academic language in very respectful ways. Tell me about that. We had a whole conversation about the work she had done to get her students to feel comfortable talking. So I didn't see evidence of bullying there, but so it was this great conversation that really makes me think about not just what I see and my value judgments and my evidence that I bring, but hearing the thinking of that person and why it was we saw what we saw.
Yeah, and often we learn so much from that teacher thinking that like our feedback would change entirely, right? And if we were just going to drop that feedback off, like knock on the door, drop it off and run away, it would be completely off base, compared to listening.
I will tell you that we did conduct a whole bunch of rigor walks. No, we had people conduct rigor walks, and give an estimate of the kind of the proficiency of rigor, the level of rigor in a class. And then 12 different districts that we did these rigor walks in gave us percent of students who grew a year on iReady. And the correlation was 0.68. And so I would argue that these 25 indicators have some predictive validity for learning. And I worry that a lot of rigor models out there haven't been ever tested to see if they related to learning or not. And I can't say that it's a correlation that's high. I can't say that it's a perfect correlation. I can't say there's a causal relationship. But it seems that there's some evidence that if these 25 things are in place at higher levels, students are more likely to learn at higher levels.
Well, Doug, as we talked about at the beginning, this is kind of a flipped sideways Flipbook, spiral bound, and enhanced with a lot of videos that people can watch to kind of see what you're talking about. Tell us a little bit about how schools are using this for professional learning.
In terms of professional learning, people are building, they're coming together as a team and saying, let's look at a couple of these factors. Let's think about our own, like, what do we do? How do we think about this? And then they're coming to see each other, which is exactly what we wanted. Teams coming together, looking at these indicators, choosing some to think about their own growth or development, and then going and seeing each other. That's what we were trying to accomplish with this, is how do we raise the expectations for learners by supporting teachers and teacher teams to think about what are the actions we could take to increase students' learning.
Douglas Fisher, thank you so much for joining me on Principal Center Radio. It's been a pleasure.
Justin, thanks for the conversation again. I appreciate the invitation and our conversation as always. Thank you for your time, and thank you all listeners for hanging out with me.
Thanks for listening to Principal Center Radio. For more great episodes, subscribe on our website at principalcenter.com/radio.